The sky above Holland burned gold that morning, September 17, 1944. 1,000 aircraft thundered over the flat fields, their shadows racing across canals and villages like a second army. Farmers looked up from their plows and froze as the heavens opened, parachutes blossoming against the light, hundreds, then thousands filling the sky like drifting flowers. The noise was endless, engines, wind, shouting, and then beneath it all a silence that no one understood. On the ground near Arnhem, the men of the 1st Parachute Brigade hit the earth running. Their boots sank into soft soil, their chutes collapsed in the wind, rifles snapped into place. They were veterans, Colonel John Frost's men, proud of their red berets and of the mission that would change the war. Seize the bridge over the Rhine and hold it until the tanks arrived. But as they assembled, as the radios crackled once, then died, the realization spread like smoke through the ranks. They could not hear anyone. No headquarters. No support. No planes answering their signals. Only static, broken and cruel. The enemy would hear nothing. The men would fight alone. And as the sun fell over Arnhem that night, the sound of gunfire rose, a desperate rhythm against the silence that doomed them all. Dawn had not yet broken when the men of the 1st British Airborne Division assembled at airfields across England. The hangars were cold, filled with the metallic stench of oil and canvas. They had studied maps of Holland for weeks, tracing the roads to Arnhem with their fingers, memorizing every river bend and village name. "It'll be over in a few days," someone said. "We'll be home by October." Laughter echoed, dry and tired. The men strapped on parachutes heavier than their own doubts and checked their weapons one last time. Operation Market Garden was to be bold, perhaps the boldest gamble of the war. Montgomery's plan was simple: drop 3 airborne divisions across Holland to capture key bridges, clearing the path for British armor to drive straight into Germany and end the war by Christmas. It was audacious, risky, and intoxicatingly close to victory. For the paratroopers, it was history waiting to be written. The engines roared to life. C-47 Dakotas lined the runway, their propellers slicing fog. Red berets nodded at one another as they climbed aboard. "See you on the bridge," they said, the words both a promise and a prayer. As the planes lifted, England fell away beneath them, fields, rivers, the faint shimmer of home. Ahead, only cloud and hope. Crossing the North Sea, the men felt the first shiver of reality. Flak burst outside the windows, black blossoms of fire. The sky filled with streaks of smoke and tracers. Yet the formation held. Inside, Frost sat quietly, his map folded in his lap. He had fought in North Africa and Sicily. He knew courage by weight and silence. "We hold that bridge," he whispered, "or we die trying." They dropped just after noon. The sunlight burned through cloud as parachutes opened like a second dawn. The ground rushed up green and wet, dotted with trees and farmhouses. Some men landed hard, rolling through ditches. Others fell into canals. Equipment scattered across the fields, rifles, canisters, radios. Within minutes, hundreds were gathering, forming companies, checking gear. The Dutch civilians emerged cautiously from hiding, waving, crying, handing out apples and water. "Welcome, Tommies." "Welcome." Frost looked at his watch. They were on schedule. Arnhem Bridge was 11 miles away. The 2nd Battalion would take it, supported by Major Digby Tatham Warder and his men. The rest of the brigade would follow. "Radio check," Frost ordered. "Crackle, static, try again." More static. The signals officer adjusted frequencies, tapped the set, frowned. Nothing. "Sir," he said, "the sets aren't receiving." Frost blinked once. "Then we walk." The march began along narrow Dutch roads bordered by willows and canals. Civilians lined the way, cheering. Resistance fighters pointed the direction, whispering warnings. "SS near the city." Heavy armor. The men smiled. The 9th SS Panzer Division was supposedly refitting far away. No one wanted to believe otherwise. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of Arnhem. The radio sets remained dead. No word from Divisional HQ. No updates from the Americans to the south. Frost's column pushed forward through quiet streets, boots crunching on cobblestone. The smell of river water mixed with burning wood. They crossed gardens, fences, and railway lines until the great iron curve of the Arnhem Bridge rose ahead. Massive, black, silhouetted against the fading sky. Then the first German shot cracked the air. A machine gun opened from a cafe rooftop, its rounds tearing through the stillness. The paratroopers dropped, firing back. Grenades shattered windows. Smoke rolled through the street. Within minutes, the air filled with shouting in English and German, the sharp echo of rifles, the roar of engines. Frost's men advanced building by building, clearing rooms with bayonets and fire. By midnight, they held the bridge. Frost established a perimeter, setting his headquarters in a house overlooking the ramp. Through broken windows, he could see the Rhine glimmering beneath the moon. The radio still refused to work. He tried again and again, calling division, corps, anyone. Only silence answered. The Germans would come at dawn. They always did. Frost poured himself a cup of cold tea and looked out at the empty road where British armor was supposed to appear. "We're here," he murmured. "Where are you?" The night after the drop, the fields outside Arnhem glowed faintly with the reflection of distant fires. Frost's men dug in around the bridge, turning cellars and gardens into fortresses. The civilians who had welcomed them with bread and coffee now watched in silence, faces pale in candlelight. The radios, those small metal hearts meant to link an army, remained mute. Men crouched around them as though warmth might bring them to life, tapping, rewiring, whispering into headsets. Nothing, just the whisper of static, the low hum of failure. By dawn, they understood the scale of their isolation. The 1st Airborne Division, scattered across miles of Dutch countryside, had no idea where its own units were. The Poles to the south waited for orders that never came. General Urquhart, somewhere in the confusion of Arnhem's suburbs, tried to raise headquarters until his own set died. Every call into the void was met by the same indifferent hiss. A bridge, a town, an entire army division, cut off by air, by distance, by silence. The men of Frost's battalion fortified the northern end of the bridge. The buildings around it, houses, shops, even a school, became strongpoints. They barricaded windows with furniture, stacked sandbags in doorways, ran wires between cellars. The bridge itself loomed above them, steel and shadow, a monument to everything that still might be won. Beneath it, the Rhine flowed dark and slow, carrying fragments of wood and leaves from upriver. The smell of oil hung in the air. "It's beautiful," someone muttered. "Like a grave." Through the morning, the sound of engines grew. German reconnaissance units probed the edges of the town, their armored cars firing sporadically. The British answered with rifles and payats, each shot echoing through narrow streets. Frost moved between positions, calm and methodical, his men stiffening at the sight of him. "We hold until relieved," he said. "Nothing else matters." The radios flickered once, briefly, then died again. A corporal cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the casing. The copper wiring inside was too short for the frequencies needed. The antennae too weak. No one had known. 1,000 details planned, 1,000 rehearsals drilled, and the bridge to victory undone by inches of wire. By midday, German infantry advanced under cover of smoke. The paratroopers held their fire until the enemy was close enough to see their faces. Then the street erupted. Bullets shattered glass and brick. Grenades rolled through doorways. Machine guns spat fire from second floors. The noise was unbearable, a thunder of stone and metal, and yet within it a strange silence still ruled. No orders came. No artillery answered. The men fought as though alone in the world. In one house, a medic worked by candlelight, binding wounds while the floor trembled under shell fire. He paused to listen. The steady breathing of the wounded, the faint crackle of the radio on the windowsill. He reached out, turned the dial, heard only that endless static. "It sounds like the sea," he whispered. The man on the cot beside him smiled weakly. "Then we'll drown together." By evening, the bridge was a furnace. German tanks pushed forward, their tracks grinding over cobblestones, their guns flashing fire into the smoke. Frost's anti-tank teams waited in silence until the first silhouette appeared through the haze. A payat thumped. The shell struck. The tank exploded in flame. The men cheered once, then went back to reloading. Their world had shrunk to a single span of steel and a handful of streets. Every window, every doorway was the front line. Across the river, the XXX Corps was supposed to be advancing, armor, artillery, supply trucks. But the roads were choked with resistance. Bridges had been destroyed, canals flooded, villages defended by desperate Germans. The radio silence meant Frost could not know how close or far his salvation was. To him, it might as well have been another continent. As darkness fell, the wounded filled the basements. A Dutch family shared their water and bread, the mother singing softly to drown out the noise. The men listened. Their faces turned toward the sound like children. Outside, the bridge glowed faintly under the flames of burning vehicles. The Rhine reflected it all, fire, smoke, sky, an image of hell moving quietly downstream. That night, Frost climbed to the top floor of his headquarters and looked out across the bridge. His men were shadows now, moving among the ruins. He thought of the maps, of the promises, of the perfect lines drawn in briefing rooms back in England. "Hold the bridge for 2 days," they had said. "Then armor will reach you." It had been 2 days already. The radio crackled again, one word, half-formed, lost in static. It might have been reinforcements, it might have been sorry. It didn't matter. Frost turned away from the window and whispered, "We'll hold until the end then." Outside, the silence deepened, heavy as the river itself. Morning broke behind smoke. Arnhem's streets were nothing but broken stone and flame. The paratroopers moved like ghosts through corridors of dust, their silhouettes flickering in and out of the haze. Every window, every doorway was a battlefield now. Men firing from attics, machine guns built into walls, snipers hidden behind curtains that fluttered with each blast. Somewhere beneath it all, under the thunder of battle, the radio still hummed faintly, whispering to no one. The 1st Parachute Brigade was scattered but unbroken. Frost's men at the bridge held firm, firing across the northern ramp, counting every round. The rest of the division, caught miles away in the suburbs and fields beyond Oosterbeek, fought to reach them. Major General Urquhart, missing for 2 days after being trapped in an attic during heavy fighting, finally made contact with remnants of the 1st and 3rd Battalions. His first words to his officers were hoarse and bitter. "Get me a signal." They tried. They failed. It was as if the air itself had turned against them. The radios picked up only ghosts, snatches of foreign voices, echoes of their own calls rebounding through the static. Operators began marking times and frequencies like prayers, switching channels, changing batteries, pointing their antennae toward the sky. But the clouds carried only silence. Some men began to imagine they heard things: laughter, music, the sound of English speech far away. Others tore off their headsets in fury, throwing them into corners. The silence mocked them more than the enemy's fire ever could. At the bridge, Frost's perimeter was shrinking. The Germans, furious at their resistance, brought up tanks from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. Artillery from across the river rained shells on every building still standing. The paratroopers answered with rifles, Piats, and sheer will. "Wait until you see the whites of their eyes," one sergeant growled. When the tanks rolled close, men leapt from windows to drop grenades straight onto engine decks. Flames turned the cobblestones red. Civilians fled through back alleys, clutching children, stepping over bodies. Some stayed, offering water and bread to the wounded. A Dutch priest moved among the ruins, blessing men who no longer believed. He stopped once beside a dying British trooper who was clutching a broken radio. The man's eyes fluttered open. "Can you hear them, Father?" he whispered. "They're calling us." The priest listened but heard only static and the faint whistle of shells. By afternoon, the British lines had been pushed back to a handful of buildings near the bridgehead. The command post, once a solid brick house, was now half rubble. Frost refused to withdraw. He limped from room to room, checking positions, offering quiet words. "Every minute we hold is a victory," he told them. "The longer we last, the closer they'll be." The men nodded, though they no longer knew who they were. Down the road, German loudspeakers blared propaganda. "British soldiers, surrender!" "You are surrounded." The answer came not from a microphone, but from a single sniper shot that shattered the speaker. Laughter rippled through the ranks, a small, defiant sound. In Oosterbeek, the rest of the Airborne Division dug into gardens and orchards, building trenches among apple trees. The wounded filled the church of St. Elizabeth's. Medics worked under stained glass that trembled with every explosion. Outside, radio operators sat on crates, headsets clamped tight, whispering call signs into the static. "Tyke calling Apple." "Tyke calling Apple. Do you read?" "Over. Nothing." One turned to another and said quietly, "If they can't hear us, maybe the dead can." The Germans attacked again at dusk, infantry supported by self-propelled guns. The paratroopers met them with everything they had left. The street fighting became so close that men could smell the oil and sweat of the enemy through the smoke. Frost himself was wounded by shrapnel, but refused evacuation. He wrapped his leg with a torn parachute and kept giving orders. When a young soldier asked how long they had to hold, Frost looked at his watch, cracked and stopped at noon. Until that starts again, he said. The night was endless. Fires lit the clouds in orange. Men huddled in cellars, the air thick with dust. Somewhere a radio clicked again. 3 sharp bursts, a pause, another burst. Morse code. The operator froze, hand trembling over the key. It was faint, nearly drowned by static, but the pattern was there. We hear you. The operator shouted for Frost. The colonel limped in, bent close to listen. The code repeated, faint, broken. We hear you. Hold. The room went silent except for that pulsing rhythm. Frost's eyes closed. Tell them, he whispered. We're still here. But when they tried to send back a reply, the signal vanished. The ghost frequency died. The static returned. Outside, the Germans closed in again. The men loaded their last magazines, their faces lit by burning rafters. In the final hours before dawn, the bridge was a skeleton of steel surrounded by fire. And yet the British still fought, holding the ruins of Arnhem as if the world depended on it. For them, it did. By the 4th day, Arnhem was no longer a city. It was a scar. The once graceful Dutch town, with its church spires and quiet canals, had been reduced to blackened skeletons of wood and stone. The air smelled of burning sugar and cordite, a sweetness that made men sick. Smoke hung so thick that sunlight came through only as a dull copper haze. Amid that poisoned dawn, the British paratroopers still fought among the ruins, clinging to each shattered room like sailors to wreckage. They had no reinforcements, no resupply, and still no word from the outside world. But they fought. Inside the command post, what remained of the 1st Parachute Brigade had gathered, tired, bloodied, their faces hollow but defiant. Colonel Frost sat against the wall, leg-bound, uniform torn and blackened. Around him, officers argued quietly over maps that were already meaningless. The radio sat in the corner like a dead god. It had not spoken since the night before. A young signals officer, his fingers bleeding from rewiring, kept adjusting the dials anyway, as if sheer will might force the machine to listen. The hum of static was their only company. Outside, the SS launched another assault. Mortars rained down on the bridgehead, shaking the ground. The paratroopers answered with rifles and Piats, though most had only a handful of rounds left. Every bullet was accounted for, every shot deliberate. The Germans advanced in waves, confident now that the British were finished. But when they reached the bridge itself, they met fire so fierce that they faltered. Smoke rolled over the water. The bridge groaned under explosions. Through the haze, Frost's men held the line, ghosts in red berets. As the sun rose higher, the heat grew unbearable. The wounded cried out for water. Medics crawled from house to house under sniper fire, carrying canteens and morphine. In one ruined room, a trooper named Connolly knelt beside a dying comrade. They'll come for us, he said. The other man smiled faintly. They already have, he whispered, and died. Connolly looked at the radio in the corner, its dial glowing dimly, and muttered, Then tell them to hurry. Back in Oosterbeek, the remnants of the division fought to survive. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade under General Sosabowski had landed across the river but could not cross. The boats were missing, the ferries sunk. From their side, they could see Arnhem burning, could hear the distant guns. They tried to raise Frost on the radio, sending desperate calls into the ether. Nothing came back. The silence stretched across the river like a wall of glass. General Urquhart ordered defensive lines drawn around Oosterbeek. The men dug trenches through gardens, used broken furniture for barricades. They were surrounded now, their radios nearly useless, their ammunition dwindling. Yet still they held their ground. If we can't reach them, Urquhart told his staff, we'll fight until we can. At the bridge, Frost's world had shrunk to a few hundred yards of rubble. Every house had been hit. The command post was a ruin. The walls shuddered with every shell. Smoke stung the eyes and dust coated every breath. Yet through it all, the men fought on, driven by duty and something deeper, stubborn pride. They refused to surrender the bridge. That afternoon, the radio sparked again. It was faint, fragile, like a heartbeat returning after death. The signals officer froze. Sir, something? Frost limped closer. The static thinned, a voice cutting through in broken fragments. Oh, armor. Advancing, hold. The room went silent. The men leaned closer. Hold 2 more days. Then silence again, 2 days. It was both a promise and a curse. Frost exhaled slowly. 2 days, he said. We can do that. They couldn't. By evening, the Germans unleashed everything they had. Tanks rolled through the smoke. their guns hammering at point-blank range. Machine guns tore through walls. Snipers picked off anyone who moved. Fire spread through the buildings, licking up wooden beams, devouring oxygen. The heat turned the air into a living thing. Men coughed black soot, their eyes watering. The wounded begged to be left behind. Frost ordered his men to fall back room by room, each step a war of its own. A shell struck the command house, tearing through the roof. The radio shattered, its final crackle lost in the explosion. The signals officer was killed instantly. Frost was thrown to the ground, his head ringing. When he came to, he saw the radio's casing lying open, wires smoking, glass shards glinting in the firelight. It looked like a small heart torn apart. "So that's that," he whispered. Night came again. The sky glowed red, reflected in the river below. German tanks idled at the far end of the bridge, their searchlights sweeping the ruins. The paratroopers were down to their last rounds, their last breaths. Frost ordered what remained of his men to withdraw toward Oosterbeek if they could. He would stay. "Someone has to keep the door open," he said quietly. They argued, but he shook his head. "Go." One by one, they slipped away through alleys and gardens, ghosts fading into the dark. Frost stayed by the window, pistol in hand, watching the bridge that had cost so much. He could see the faint reflection of the fires on the water, hear the groan of metal cooling. The radio sat silent beside him, blackened and useless. He reached out, touched it once more as if saying goodbye. Outside, the first German voices called for surrender. Frost didn't answer. He closed his eyes and listened instead, to the silence that had betrayed them, that had bound them, that had defined their courage. In that silence, he imagined the voices of his men across the river. Still fighting, still holding, still calling into the void. And for a moment, just before the dawn broke again over Arnhem, he could almost hear them, when the guns fell silent. The bridge still stood, blackened, twisted, but standing. Smoke curled around its girders like breath from a dying beast. The Rhine beneath was calm again, flowing past the ruins as if nothing had happened. For 3 days after the last shot, the fires smoldered in the wreckage of Arnhem. The cries of the wounded had faded to whispers, and even the birds stayed away. Only the wind moved, carrying the scent of ash and oil and something older, the smell of sacrifice that never leaves a battlefield. The survivors were rounded up at dawn. Barely 100 men remained of Frost's battalion, limping, burnt, dazed. The Germans treated them with an odd mixture of respect and disbelief. "Sie sind verrückt," one officer muttered. "They are mad." Perhaps they were. For 7 days they had held the impossible. They had turned a bridge into a fortress and silence into defiance. When Frost was carried out on a stretcher, his face pale beneath the grime, he saluted the bridge one last time. "We did our part," he murmured. Back in Oosterbeek, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division fought their final stand along the river banks. The British artillery never came. The radios that could have guided it were gone. The men held trenches dug through gardens and orchards surrounded by flame and water. When the order finally came to withdraw across the Rhine, it was whispered from man to man like a secret. There were no working radios left to send it. In the darkness and rain, Royal Engineers ferried them across in rubber boats under constant fire. The river ran black with oil and blood, swallowing voices, carrying them downstream. At dawn, Oosterbeek was empty. The Germans walked through the mud and counted the bodies. The British dead were buried where they fell, under apple trees, beside barns, near the churchyard that had become a field hospital. Among the wreckage, they found radios burned and broken, their wires fused by heat, their dials forever frozen mid-turn. The silence that had doomed the operation still hung in the air like smoke. When word reached England, it came not as a report but as a rumor. Arnhem has fallen. Families listened to the radio, waiting for names that never came. Montgomery called it a partial success. The men who had survived called it something else. It was hell, one said. Hell with good manners. Colonel Frost spent the rest of the war in captivity, his leg never fully healing. When the Germans interrogated him, they asked why he had not surrendered earlier. Frost simply replied, "We had orders to hold the bridge." Years later, when he stood again on the rebuilt span, renamed the John Frost Bridge, he stared at the river below for a long time. "We weren't beaten," he said softly. "We were just unheard decades past." The bridge became a monument the town rebuilt. Each year, Dutch children placed flowers at its foot, and veterans in faded berets saluted under gray skies. Tourists came with cameras expecting to find history, but history here was not a thing of metal or stone. It was in the silence, in the way the wind moved across the river, in the hum of the air that seemed to carry distant voices. At night, when the town slept, the Rhine whispered its old refrain. Locals swore that on quiet evenings you could still hear it, the faint click of Morse, the ghostly rhythm of radios long dead. We hear you, hold, and then nothing. Only the river flowing toward the sea, carrying the memory of men who spoke into the void and fought until the silence became their legacy. The bridge could not speak, but it remembered.